Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
Conservative. Constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
Lift your nose, take a whiff. Can you smell that? We're but 1 week and a day away from Election Day for the primaries. Early voting will start soon, and the air is heavy. It reeks of desperation. Desperation coming from the corruption, coming from the corrupt powers, those that make profits off your backs, off our governments, off ensuring that government regulations and handouts stay in place or only increase in order to protect their market shares and their bottom lines. People and organizations that enjoy government-protected profits to the tunes of billions of dollars right here in Kentucky, they're desperate because perhaps they bit off a bit more than they can chew. They're finding out there are limitations to the almighty dollar. They've decided to turn this election into a referendum on them. It wasn't something the grassroots, the true conservatives, the true Republicans, and we know that those who stand against them are the true and quote-unquote normal Republicans. Evidence I'll provide to that claim either today or tomorrow. But this isn't something, we didn't create this referendum. I didn't. Yes, we challenged some of their candidates. Yes, we went out and recruited them. Yes, we put them forward to challenge some of their champions. But their actions have turned this into a referendum because the powers that be decided they wanted this to be their make or break year. And I think they've overexposed themselves because they are spending too much in these different races that are not looking very good for them whatsoever. And I don't think they'll get their most ultimate outcome for those who are standing against liberty, standing against conservatism. But those who have those values, I think, are looking pretty good. And I'll go over today just how we can tell that these people are pretty desperate. I'll go into this tomorrow as well because I'll be digging into 7 different House races. Most of them I have mentioned before, but I've not dug into the nitty-gritty on the numbers, the data, the layings, what the decision-making processes are. How that these groups have overexposed themselves here. I haven't done that, and so I will do so. Because I know that the real Republicans, us normal Republicans, us conservatives, we are chastised so often by these corrupt powers because we're wrong or incorrect, but yet the truth does count for something. Honesty has value, and that's something they're trying to outspend. We see that that's what they're doing. Well, but before I go into discussing those races, I want to first turn my attention away from the State House that we'll be discussing most of today and tomorrow. And instead, I want to take a moment to talk about an incumbent senator running for re-election here in Kentucky. Now, longtime listeners of the show know I do not particularly like Senator Stephen Meredith. In my opinion, he's kind of a jerk. He's a person, as I've said before, who could find a way to talk down to Jesus himself. His voting record is lackluster, but about the same as the rest of the Senate. But it's the way he addresses issues that bothers me. This is why I dislike him. It's not as much his voting record, though I have issues with it, but it's how he lies, he exaggerates, how he's self-important. But at the same time, he's just so full of himself, he doesn't even realize when he has his own foot in his mouth and continues to double down. It's a extreme flaw he has. I saw this firsthand about a year ago when I was running for state treasurer, and I saw Senator Meredith address one of his district Republican parties in his Senate district, one of the county parties there. And while he was there talking to them, giving a legislative update, he chose to get into it with someone from the crowd. The person in the crowd didn't go after him, but Senator Meredith decided he didn't like some comment the person had made on Facebook. Not a comment that was below the belt, but a comment about him as a senator not following the Constitution and making an argument about legislation as to why. And he didn't respond to the comment like a well-adjusted individual, like a well-adjusted elected senator or anybody who's elected, because you realize you've signed up to be criticized publicly. Like, you're going to be criticized online. You're going to be criticized in person. People are going to say things they don't like about what you've done, and you just learn to accept it sometimes. It's just something you take and you move on. Take it into consideration, and the fact if you're hearing it a lot, maybe you're not representing your district super well on an issue, but you're just going to get criticized no matter what you do. Stop taking it so personal. And I'm saying this from experience. I engage on topics every day on the show. I've decided on my own free will to put my ideas and thoughts out there. I've decided to actively go out and search on radio stations to air it. I've decided to actively search and look for other opportunities to spread the message. And I've got some big announcements coming on that here in the next week or two. We'll get past this primary before I make those announcements. But I have learned from experience by somebody who talks about politics all days that not everyone will agree with you, and they will make comments and statements and emails, and sometimes you just don't respond. And most of the time, if it's critical of you, you don't respond because you won't be right. Even when some of the statements and comments are dumb and infuriating, you learn to just brush it off and get over it, because most of the time it doesn't actually matter. Like, one of the dumbest criticisms I'll get, and it actually, this one does make me want to go off on people, but I always kind of hold myself back from saying what I fully want to say. But what I can't stand is when someone says, well, why won't you cover this topic? Or why won't you talk about this? Or you don't talk about this enough. And they're talking about a topic or a story that I have literally covered several times or cover all the time, or at least occasionally do, but they don't feel that I talk about it enough. And instead of going out there and getting their own show, they'd rather just, of course, complain to me. And the only way that they could ever be happy with me is if I literally sat on here all day long and all I talked about was their one issue for almost an hour a day each and every day, their one pet project. And if I veered off of it even for a minute, they would call me out from deviating and for not being true enough. And it's extremely irritating. But when I see those people making those comments online, most of the time I don't respond. And certainly when I see them in public, I don't say anything to them either. I've just become to accept that you will get criticism as you're doing something publicly. And you would hope that this is something Senator Meredith would have learned, because despite having been in office almost a decade and being over 70 years old, Senator Meredith just hasn't matured into understanding that you don't need to overreact to what every single person says. And so at this event, at this meeting, he calls somebody out for saying that he proposed an unconstitutional law, to which Meredith responded by saying that he knows that the law he proposed is unconstitutional, but we didn't really understand the process. And just because he would propose a law doesn't mean he actually supports the law or wants the law to pass. He just wanted to get the conversation going. That's what he really said. Now just think about that for a second. What he said is that we were the dumb ones for making this silly assumption that if a state senator sponsors a piece of legislation, it means they support it and want it to pass, and he expects you to somehow buy that simple conclusion that senators shouldn't sponsor legislation they don't want to pass. Well, that's a wrong conclusion. That's not accurate. Sure, it's common sense, and sure, it's how they read it into the record and phrase it, but if you were really the expert like him, you'd know this. Now, this is clearly a situation where Steve Meredith had gotten out on over his skis, but there's other examples of this that are leading to this most recent occurrence that literally I saw just this past week on Facebook, of where, once again, can't just accept, move past these foibles, Senator Meredith. And I think you could be a great senator, possibly. But we'll be discussing that after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. your source for Kentucky politics.
Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Before the break, I was going over how State Senator Stephen Meredith has a history of, his voting records run in the mill, could use some improvement, but his bedside manner is a little what's out of control when it comes to him. And he's in a re-election campaign, and his inability to control himself has reared its ugly head. Now, I'd mentioned in the past how I'd seen him do this live. Another thing we've seen him do, where he just kind of lies to cover his own tuchus, was in a situation where Meredith had gotten called out, State Senator Meredith, had gotten called out for sponsoring the legislation that led to, if you may remember, the 5-acre rule, saying you have to have at least 5 acres or more of land to hunt and fish on your own land without a license. And he had sponsored that. And when he was challenged for sponsoring it, saying he supported that law, he claimed that, that's dumb people. That's dumb people saying that they don't understand how this works. We're seeing a theme here, but that's dumb people. They don't understand how it works. You see, that was thrown in the last minute into the bill, and it just happens sometimes that way. But that was obviously false. That particular provision about the 5 acres had been in the original piece of legislation when it was first proposed months ago. It was in there when Meredith threw his name on it to support it. He was just lying because he couldn't just admit he had messed up. Same thing as when he proposed an unconstitutional law. He couldn't just admit, didn't realize it was so unconstitutional, decided I wanted to pull it. No, his bedside manner, his ability to just not see past himself kicked in. Well, we have a new occurrence of State Senator old Stephen Meredith lying to himself to make himself sound more important in his most recent re-election campaign, and it comes in the form of just a ridiculous claim he is making that his chairmanship on health services he somehow put on the line for pro-life causes this last year. That's what he's saying. He's running around saying that he's so pro-life, he put his chairmanship on the Senate Health Services Committee. He put that on the line, which is a ridiculous claim, obviously. He didn't put his chairmanship on the line for pro-life causes. We know what causes people to lose committee assignments and chairmanships. We've seen it. Publicly going against leadership, that's a really obvious way to do it. And possibly repeated offenses of not calling forward the bills they want called forward or calling forward a bill they don't want called forward. That can be an issue. So obviously, there was no public call from leadership to pull forward an anti-pro-life bill. Now, we've seen them behind the scenes claiming we need to get exceptions in place, but they would never push for that, obviously, this year because it's a re-election and campaign year. Their big push to put in exemptions, if they're going to do it, will be next year or in another off-year election. They want to do it away from, obviously, when a lot of them are facing primaries. So this push would come next year. So we know that that's not it. Now, he could perhaps be claiming that he pulled forward pro-life legislation that leadership was mad about, talking here about a bill that would provide counseling services to people whose women whose pregnancies have been determined, quote-unquote, non-viable for them to receive counseling. That may lead to them saying, well, they claim it's non-viable, but there is a percentage chance they could survive. Maybe you want to have the child. That type of counseling, that was a pro-life type, quote-unquote, legislation. Which seems like common sense. But to provide that kind of counseling to pregnant women who've gotten some of the most unfortunate news out there. So he could be saying, well, he called that forward into his committee for a vote, but he wasn't going to lose his chairmanship for calling that forward. While leadership maybe doesn't love pro-life issues, they still know well enough that they aren't going to punish a chairman for taking action on them. And here's the other way we know that this is obviously false. If you're really so pro-life that you'd lose a chairmanship over pro-life causes, then you would be pro-life enough to call out the members of leadership and call out leadership who needs to be replaced that threatened your chairmanship over pro-life causes. I mean, if this is your hill to die on, Senator, if this is your line in the sand, which it would have to be in order for you to say, I alone will stop this or will pull this forward, never mind the consequences, never mind my possible loss of chairmanship. Well, if that's how you feel, you would have called out leadership at the time. You'd also be working with other caucus members to make a real active change in leadership in the Senate. Nothing I've heard of along those lines has come from Senator Meredith. I haven't heard of him doing anything now along those lines. So here's the thing. Just be honest. And what's funny is Meredith most likely doesn't even need to lie here. If there is a flaw, maybe equal or greater to Senator Meredith's bedside manner, it's the fact that he cares so much about what's going on Facebook. I say this all the time to people. I'll say this, I'm on social media a lot. I take part in these spaces on Twitter, and I'll say this all the time in them. We are not the people who are outside this room. The social media political crowd that comments all the time and follows politics a lot are not the vast majority of people who show up to vote. I mean, a year later, most of the people who show up in the primary to vote on Meredith or not can't even remember who they voted for, won't remember who their state senator is. Shoot, anyone who knocks a door for a candidate knows most of the people you talk to don't even know that everyone in a primary is a Republican. That if you show up and vote in a partisan race in May, you're voting for nothing but Republicans. They don't know that, despite it having been the case forever. Do you think these same people are paying attention to what's going on in the political social media universe? They don't care, and they're not paying attention. It doesn't matter. Now, maybe 20 years from now, it might matter, but we're in rural Kentucky right now, and it doesn't matter. And like I said, Senator Meredith is over 70 years old. So 20 years from now, he'd be 91. So unless he's planning on still running for office at 91, maybe he should just stay away from the Facebooks. Like I said, his voting record is run of the mill. He does and says some questionable things. But I'm sure after you get by his prickly and condescending and awful bedside manner and past his inability to be calm and non-confrontational on every little thing, especially things that happen on Facebook, he probably has some redeeming qualities, and he will most likely win re-election. Just kind of the fact of the matter. So, Senator, I want to encourage you to buck up. Get the chip off your shoulder. You're in an elected position. Get used to being questioned and criticized. And hey, for 1 second, put down the phone, put down the computer, get off the Facebooks, get off the Twitters. It's not real life. Okay, it's not real life. Now, going on to what I talked about at the beginning, I believe some corrupt powers here in Kentucky are out over their skis. I talk about them often on the program, but it's worth noting how they have created such a very, very expensive bed that is reeking of desperation, and now they have to lay in it. So let me put forward the battle lines, the lay of the land for you, okay? So you can understand what's exactly going on in these races. So you'll have a few key industries and groups giving to a few key places. And then they'll also give to individual candidates, and different politicos and people within politics will give to individual candidates. But the industries are really giving to a few key PACs. All of them representing the government needs to solve your problems, industries need to be protected to survive, government needs to work. They always forget about the you part. It doesn't need to work for you. It just needs to work, whatever that means. And we know that when they're saying, we just need to make government work. We don't want people who throw fire on the flames and walk away. We want people who want government to work. We know that what they're talking about is they want it to work against us, because if literally government just stayed still, we'd all be better off. Like, just, for sake of, I know most of you would probably agree with me, but just for sake of it, if you can remember, and I know some of you can't, but if we rewind to 2000, if all the government regulations, laws, and taxation stayed the same as they were then, do you think we'd be better or worse off as a society? I think a lot of us would say we'd probably be better off. That the more time government makes more laws, the worse off we are. So, I mean, government work, what do you mean by that? And of course, what they mean is that they want to serve these interests that need government regulations to protect them, protect their bottom line. They need the handouts from the taxpayers. And you know, you'll have industries, to just give you an example of some of these industries. You have Churchill Downs, of course, the horse tracks, hospitals. They profit literally billions a year. And yet they still need to make sure, we still hear lines from our elected people like, hey, look, we got to protect these groups. We got to keep them in place. We got to make government work for them, because if they don't, bad things will happen. We hear this all the time from them. I've talked about this before. Churchill Downs literally projected to make over $1 billion a year in profit, but yet gray machines, the gas station slot machines, they were damaging to their bottom line. You know, record profits, but yet we had senators on the floor talking about how they're worried about charitable gaming affecting the horse industry. That's right, you playing bingo at your local churches. They were worried about that. Kind of crazy. But let me kind of lay out who some of these groups are here as we talk about these elections. So it's really going to, these industries are mainly giving to one individual candidates. They sometimes have their own PACs, but also they're giving to these two action PACs, these two kind of overall reaching active PACs. One is the Commonwealth Conservative Coalition, run by Don Parkinson, the former Jefferson County chairman. That's in Louisville. And you have Common Sense Kentucky, run by Trey Watson, former state communication director for Republican Party of Kentucky, and he's currently a political consultant. I'm sure he does other things with his day job. I don't know what. But anyways, and so Commonwealth Conservative Coalition has raised over $500,000, and the Commonwealth or Common Sense Kentucky has raised over the last few years, they're well over $100,000. We'll be talking about where they're getting their money from, what these interests have in these different Kentucky races. After this short break, you're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before the break, I was digging into the players in this year's elections, the big players to know, the people that the corporations are giving so much money to. And there's two PACs. They're getting involved on what's called the side of evil, okay? We'll call it, at least from my side of things, right? A lot of you listen to the show know pretty much where I fall. I'm a Republican who is a constitutional conservative. Some call it liberty. But I am a, maybe you call me an idealist, but I believe in the party platform. And when I say the other side, I'm talking about, maybe you call it the uniparty, the establishment, whatever you want to call it, but the people who have put aside principles in the search of just raw power. And those people who look at government as team red shirt versus team blue shirt, that look at elections only in those senses, that don't ask what is going to be the net result of what we do here, how does this affect people's lives, but instead say, hey, I want to amass as much power and money as I can, so whatever I need to do. And on that side of things, we have two PACs, the Commonwealth Conservative Coalition, run by Don Parkinson, former Jefferson County chair, and Common Sense Kentucky, run by Trey Watson, former state communications director for Republican Party of Kentucky. And when we look at the Commonwealth Conservative Coalition, they've raised at least around $500K so far for this cycle. Their major donors are $25,000 from Cooperrider, a construction company that has been pushing for millions in state handouts for the Northern Kentucky work. Something that is important for people to note as we go into probably what is tomorrow's show, talking about the incumbents in Northern Kentucky. They've also gotten, the Conservative Commonwealth Coalition has also gotten $15,000 from Airbnb, $70,000 from healthcare and hospitals, $200,000 from Churchill Downs, and $200,000 from Better Schools Kentucky, which is the teachers union PAC. Teachers Union PAC. That's Jefferson County Teachers Association's PAC, Better Schools Kentucky. They gave $200,000 to this PAC. Then you have Common Sense Kentucky, who's received $100,000 from Better Schools. So that's those you keeping track at home. $300,000 given out to Republican, quote unquote Republican PACs to get involved in the primaries here in Kentucky. And then they got $40,000 in 2022, some of that's still left over. Now, I want you to think about who is giving the money here to understand what's going on. What are the issues that they're fighting on? What is it that these people who started these PACs and these people who are giving money to these PACs, what is it that's important to them? That, them as the quote-unquote, as they call it, normal Republicans are supporting. Well, if you're in Northern Kentucky, Certificate of Need laws are going to be a big fighting point. Why? Well, Certificate of Need laws protect hospital monopolies. And in Northern Kentucky, you have St. East, the only hospital servicing literally tens of thousands of Kentuckians. And the Northern Kentucky cadre certainly takes a big issue with that because it's affecting the costs and price of their health care. Then, for Better Schools Kentucky, they're, of course, worried about the regulations that the legislators are passing, stopping them from executing their liberal agenda in the schools, as well as fighting on school choice specifically, because especially if the constitutional amendment passes, well, now that legislation, how school choice gets funded, they believe could affect them greatly. For Churchill Downs, you have things like gray machine, sports betting, the regulations that go into gambling. Like I said, a few years ago, they were making $200-300 million a year in profits, and now they're expected to make over $1 billion due to the fact that we as Kentucky put in sports betting, but then also we put in sports betting and only let the horse tracks have the licenses for the sports betting. Not like a bar can't sports bet, hold a license. You can't have a bookmaker now just on sports betting. No, you have to be you have to own a horse track in order to run sports bets through your organization. And of course, too, as well, getting rid of the gray machines as a big push in 2023. So understand that these are things that the special interests care about, and for them, they've turned it into a make it or break it year. You see, most politicians are really, really easy to understand. The vast majority, the sheep ones, the ones that are finding their value from just being in office. They've always wanted to be in office. They feel special. They don't particularly care about what they're doing. They're probably less informed on the issues than you are. And that's the vast majority of them. The sheep ones, they just want to be clapped for. They like the title. And so they're motivated by getting elected, staying elected, and getting elected to higher office eventually, maybe if they can. But staying in office, that's the number one thing they care about. So when it comes to the battle lines of the issues, on which side they're going to fall, on the public schools, on the horse tracks and gambling, on the hospitals, all of these industries exist in a heavily regulated by government environment. And these government regulations, if they're done the right way for those who currently exist, are hugely profitable. It locks out competition, makes it harder for people to get involved and challenge you. It's hugely profitable for them, and they already have a foothold, and so they're going to be pushing to protect that foothold. And when it comes to those issues, the vast majority of legislators, because these are not issues that the average Kentuckian is very well informed on. The average Kentuckian is not very well informed on Certificate of Need laws and healthcare regulations. The average Kentuckian is not very well informed on our gambling regulations and just how corrupt it is. The average Kentuckian is somewhat informed on their public schools, I think, but a lot of them haven't dug into the issues, the data on it, in a whole lot of ways, and so they can be swayed one way or another. And so when it comes to voting on those issues, since you don't have a whole lot of grassroots all the time, you're starting to see more, but priorly you didn't see a lot at all, but your vast majority of your voters are not going to be pushing heavy on those issues. And so for the establishment, the anti-free market people, the good governance is picking and choosing winners and losers. The champions that they have there, the bulwark representing those companies to be the most outspoken advocates for their industries, they're kind of guiding those sheep along, saying, hey, follow me, you'll be okay. Now, why do those people take that leadership position? Why do they do that? Well, most likely they, one, want to be in leadership. They want to be powerful in politics. It's not just enough to have the title. They want to have more power, and they're looking at and learning from what I call the McConnell method. Do the work of the corporations, get control of their PAC donations, get control of their money, and then you get control over the rest of your elected colleagues, and now you have power. Not to accomplish anything, no. As 1984 says, that's just power for the sake of power. That's the entire point. So that's how they start down this road. But then you have an occasional champion on the other side that emerges and says, look, guys, our principles, remember what we believe in? Well, this isn't it. You can vote your conscience. You can vote in a way that you don't need to feel uncomfortable explaining on why you're corrupt, what your principle, why you vote the way you do to the informed people back home. You could actually maybe sleep at night and still get to hold office. You don't have to sell your soul to be here. Voting the way that the corrupt forces want you to are actually exposing you to larger chances to lose. So both sides here are trying to convince those the rest of them, that in order for them to stay in office, they need to go in their direction. So for both sides, you have to do three things in this order of importance. Protect your people, win open seats, take down the other side's guys. And protecting your people is the most important, because if you lose who's currently in office and voting your way, and you can't show that you'll protect them when they take those hard votes and they put their necks out there, nobody will want to follow along. So we're going to look at 4 elections here. One is going to be Kim Mosier, incumbent, at risk, a bulwark champion for the Certificate of Need hospitals. Now, she's in that northern Kentucky area, so that puts her at risk with that Certificate of Need, because that's where, if you're out in the rural areas or the central areas, where there's more hospitals choices, there's more competition, or there's just no one, they think that there's not a whole lot of people that want to come out there, even though the data says there is. But anyways, that wouldn't be as much of a big issue. But when you're in that northern Kentucky area, where you have literally tens of thousands of Kentuckians only able to go to one hospital, it's a heavily populated area, and the only reason why is because St. East has used Certificate of Need laws here in Kentucky to protect their market share. That's going to open you up. But you might be okay. She wouldn't maybe be at risk, but because she's so sold out to the medical industry in 2023, when bills were passing to stop gender transition surgeries, the hospitals didn't like that. And instead of encouraging her to just vote for something that will pass anyways, or, just vote no, Kim went out there and voted no, and then also called everyone else voting to stop hospitals from chopping off the genitalia of minors Neanderthals. We'll be going over who their champions are, their issues. After this short break, you're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back in this final segment of the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So, Killian Timoney, he's another one of the swamp champions. Sure, he's the school's main champion, of course, as he works for Fayette County Public Schools and will vote their way on almost everything. But he's also so bought into the schools are always right that he voted, for an example, on allowing men in women's sports, not protecting women's sports here in Kentucky, because the liberal schools didn't like that. And so he just voted how they wanted them to. Or the gender transitioning things. He goes out there and says parents don't have a right to their kids once they go to schools, but then turns around and says kids do have a right to chemically castrate their children. So not only is he voting against school choice and pushing for more school funding on everything, but even things they know will pass anyways, he's still voting with them. And because of this, he's at a lot of risk. He's also done some work for the horse track, sponsoring bills to ban grain machines. But at the same time, he's so bought in, and he's lost so much of his conservative values that Timoney has proposed pro-abortion legislation, which gives him even more exposure. Michael Meredith is a Chamber of Commerce champion, a horse track rep, and he'll even vote against school choice, but he's so corruptible, and you can tell because of how he votes against these issues, like voting against banning minors at drag shows. He's so corruptible that was heavily involved in a sexual misconduct scandal involving the sexual harassment of House staffers, resulting in taxpayer-funded settlements, putting him at more risk. Richard Heath. Yeah, he may do the work on the ag side. Locally, the desire for the payoff led to him suing, and his wife and him suing a small local business for having a sign that's been up there for years. They sued them for having the sign because their daughter was in an accident that, if they can't blame the sign, she's allegedly at fault for. So you have 4 people here that are trying to protect. But you see, the interest shoved them out there, And they also have lost so much of their conservative principles that they're at such risk from conservatives. But if they don't protect these people who vote their way, well, they're going to have a lot of problems. And they're getting desperate. When we look at each of these races, and we're going to look at them from the least worrisome for them to the most worrisome, we can see where the desperation is coming from. So let's first turn to Richard Heath running for re-election versus Kim Holloway. Now, this would, I say, is least important because Heath is a less obvious champion with his work as the Ag Commissioner chair. It's important, but it's just less obvious. But to the schools and others, he's pretty run-of-the-mill. A Heath loss to them can be explained to the other members as saying, well, if you really want us to defend you and be safe, you got to really vote with us. And it shows in the spending. So Heath has gotten an independent expenditure from the Commonwealth Conservative Coalition of $40,000, and from Patient Access, which is the pro-con law group, threw in another $2,500. That puts him at $42,500 in outside independent expenditure spending from PACs, while Heath has also raised $30,000 himself, putting his total at $72,500. A hefty amount, especially considering that the last time there was a primary in this district, less than 1,000 people showed up to vote. Now I'm going to talk about something called diminishing rate of return, basically a point where the more spending that you do on a race sort of kind of doesn't make a difference. We've seen this in, for example, the governor's race where Cameron spent $2 million-ish, 2.5, and Kelly Craft spent like 15, but it didn't really matter because there's a rate of diminishing returns. And for a House race, I normally say this is around $50,000 because once everybody kind of knows you're running, it's like, okay, I get it. So to compare this race here, I'm going to compare all these races to like a congressional race. When you think about a congressional race, there's like 17 House races and one congressional race. And you hear maybe more about congressional spending than you would House spending. So the amount that they've spent here would be like the equivalent of Comer spending $1.2 million in a re-election primary race, which would be high, but not unheard of. You can smell the desperation in this race as the money is coming in late. I can tell they didn't think Heath would be having as much of an issue as he's having based solely on how late in the game they're showing interest. And while this is low on the totem pole, it does have consequences because Heath does have kind of a run-of-the-mill voting record. So the special interests can't say, vote our way most of the time, keep your head down, we won't attack you, but neither will they. That won't be true because, well, it's obvious that they will attack you and they can win. Then you have Kim Mosier running against Karen Campbell. This is another one where I think they didn't expect to be having as many issues as they are. Kim is getting some late help, but she reeks of desperation when you look at a mailer that went out for Kentuckians for All of Us, and oh boy, it must have killed them to send this out, because this mailer says the word conservative, I don't even know how many times. It says, endorsed by the NRA, endorsed by Right to Life, endorsed by all these places, conservative, conservative, conservative. It's like they're playing a game, how many shots could I take every time they say conservative? But why should this bother Kentuckians for All of Us? Why would this bother the PAC that mailed this out? Because Kentuckians for All of Us is set up specifically for Kim, funded by $35,000 from a Jane Van Meter. And the group consulting on this is the big LGBTQ consulting group. For an example, on their homepage, they have an artist drawing of a crowd of people waving gay flags and signs saying "Down with Trump." So this is directly being made in defense of her Neanderthals comment. And the hope is from the LGBTQ crowd that as they step in here and they might be able to one day roll back the legislation that's preventing them from giving chemical castration drugs to minors and shoving socks down little girls' pants and calling that suicide prevention. Of course, the hospitals are jumping in too. She is suddenly having a little more trouble than expected. For the hospitals, they can't afford to see her go down, and it'll blow a pretty big blow to them in the con law fight. But if she does go down, they can at least still claim that that's a Northern Kentucky thing that doesn't count because Northern Kentucky is just weird. That was the line 2 years ago when 3 incumbents all lost in Northern Kentucky. Well, you got Michael Meredith. Well, Commonwealth Conservative Coalition has dumped $118,000 into that race, plus the realtors have dumped another $8,000. Then Michael Meredith himself has raised $154,000. And you know you're struggling when you have to spend $280,000 in a state house race. That'd be like Comer spending $4.732 million in a congressional primary election running for re-election. It shows big trouble because you have, once again, that rate of diminishing returns. Then you have what's maybe the most desperate race of all. And if anything, they should just abandon this race early on, because the more spinning you do and the spinning at this level, when you lose, and I'm telling you, it's going to be real hard for them to win this one. The level you've spent then to lose will do you so much harm in the battle lines. And so when we look at the spending here, we see that Timney himself has raised, I don't actually know how much. Why don't I know? Well, he's never filed his financial disclosures. And we should really pause here quick and ask, what's the use of the requirements for you to file financial disclosures? The last deadline was almost a month ago, and yet, or the first deadline that Timney hasn't hit was almost a month ago, and he just hasn't done it. And literally nothing's happened to him. If it's a glitch, well, why would they have a glitch in literally the House race in the state legislature that will have the most amount of spending? That seems kind of suspicious. So let's get real here. But let's say he's raised $50,000. Well, an independent expenditure, he has $285K in spending. That means his total spending is $325,000 at least in a state House primary for an incumbent. We've been looking at congressionals, but let's go over to governor here, okay? Remember, Kelly Craft spent like $15 million in an open seat, Cameron 2.5. This would be the equivalent of spending $32.5 million on a governor's re-election campaign in the primary for size and scale. $32.5 million. That's crazy. And he still has a pretty good chance of losing. And he is extra desperate. How do we know? Check out this attack ad from his campaign.
Thomas Jefferson supports and profits off a violent liberal agenda. Thomas Jefferson makes his money from a violent culture, destruction of property, Black Lives Matter protesters, drag shows for children. Thomas Jefferson pretends to share our Kentucky values. The truth? Thomas Jefferson is just all sorts of wrong for Kentucky.
So let me explain what they're attacking Thomas Jefferson on here. They're so desperate that they're attacking him for he has an IRA, Roth IRA's retirement accounts, and those retirement accounts have stock holdings. That's the attack. They're saying that because he has a Roth IRAs and, money accounts that he has his investments in, and then they hold stock in publicly traded companies, that somehow he profits off the BLM agenda. That's the source they're citing. It makes no sense. They're just making it up, but this is what you have to do when you're desperate. You have nothing else you can say. And at a certain point, if you're Timney, you just got to admit, maybe you should just vote better. Instead of lying and being this trashy, because that ad came directly from his campaign. Instead of just lying at a certain point, maybe you sit down and say, maybe I should just not be such a horrible conservative voter, or just change my party if this is how I'm going to be. If I have to lie, cheat, steal, and spend this much, maybe, I don't know, I'm doing something wrong. Well, y'all, that's what we have time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll be back here tomorrow to cover some of these other races. Y'all have a great rest of your day.